Everyone. In this video, we're going to further explore restrictions in Desmos. We're going to look at adding two restrictions to an equation. Okay, so if you watched the previous video, I talked a little bit about the power of Desmos' restrictions. And so part of that is because you don't have to just add one restriction, you can add two restrictions. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a circle of radius 1 centered at the origin, and we're going to restrict it so that we only graph the part of the circle in quadrant 1. All right, so let's get started. First, let's write the equation of a circle centered at the origin, radius 1. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we want to graph only the part of the circle that's in quadrant 1. So that's this part right here down to here. Okay, now, first, okay, so we're going to do this by adding two restrictions. We're going to add a restriction in x and a restriction in y. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is, if we look at the circle in quadrant 1, we know that x is positive. So we have to add a restriction that says only graph when x is positive. So I add a restriction, x greater than 0. Okay, so now when I add that restriction in, you can see that I get the right half of the circle. And that makes sense. It's because you're telling Desmos only graph the equation when the x-coordinate's positive. Now, when the x-coordinate's positive, that means you graph the upper right part of the circle and the lower right quarter of the circle because the x-coordinate's positive. Now, we only want to graph this part right here, right? The part that's in quadrant 1. All right, well, what do we know about quadrant 1? We know that in quadrant 1, the y-coordinate is also positive. So we're going to add another restriction that tells Desmos, only graph this guy when y is positive. So all we got to do is we add another restriction right next to the other restriction and type in y is greater than 0. And there you go. Easy peasy. So this right here says we're going to graph the equation of the circle right here, x squared plus y squared is equal to 1. But we have two restrictions. We have this restriction in x that says only when x is positive, so that's the right half of the plane. But we also have this other restriction that also has to be satisfied. So that also, it's like another statement that has to be true. It's like two-step verification a lot of companies do now when you try to log into a website. Okay, it also says that only when y is positive. And y is positive when in quadrant 1. So you can see that we can combine restrictions. We can combine restrictions in both variables if we need to, simply by putting two restrictions right next to each other in the same equation.